So today is Thursday, the 9th of March, 2023. And today's Tech Hour, the subject is Unlatex, textbox, and the access tree. And the main topic is going to be the work I've done to implement part of Unlatex. And I've done enough to allow us to start working on generating an access tree. The full realm of Unlatex is difficult and I think important, but the textbox is something that's a preliminary to the PDF that has more information than the PDF and is easier to access programmatically. My goal is to see if we can't get an access tree out of the textboxes of a document without too much difficulty. I'm quite concerned if there's bad news to get it early, as well as if there's good news to get it early. So some feasibility studies on textbox would be really useful. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start screen sharing. It's the entire screen, and I'm going to allow that. And I've got an Emacs window in case I need it. I'm going to start with the web browser. So this is the Unlatex site on GitHub. I'll just make the letters. We're now in mobile view because I've made everything so much bigger. So the main point is that there's a script that will take if you give it a LaTeX file and information about where to put things and what to call things, it'll generate for you the textbox files automatically. And the textbox files are one command to a line, and the commands are, so to speak, nested in the same way that the contents of a HTML page are nested. And they contain all the information you need to produce the PDF. So they're quite rich, but they don't have the tagging information. On the other hand, they're not as complicated as the PDF because the PDF has got all sorts of font information. So I'm going to go through how to create textbox files on your own machine. And I'll give a sort of fairly simple script that should always work. And then you can make things more sophisticated. So you create a directory, and then you go into that directory, you clone the repository and go into the resulting clone. You make two directories, one called temp and one called tbx. The temp is for the working files that are needed for the compilation. And the textbox is where the outputs go. You'll also need to create a source directory, and you'll have to download from the archive, for example, a document, the source of a document, and move it into the source directory and unzip it. These things could in principle be automated, except the archive seems to stop you automating downloads. And then you run a commit. Then you run a single command. I'm afraid it's quite a long command line. So it's a Python script. So you call Python with the name of the script. You give it the name of the temp file, which is simply where the stuff you're going to use that you don't care about will go. So in this case, you'll typeset the document, but you don't care about the typeset outputs. You're interested in the log file, which has got the boxes in it, the text boxes. And you say, where are you going to put the text boxes? And you give it a job name. You can give the resulting files whatever name you want. And then you finally give it the file that you want to have processed. So it seems to be a fairly easy process on my machine, and I wrote the software, so somebody else might have problems. The main point I'm saying here is that it can run programmatically, it can run automatically. There are no special requirements on the file that you compile except for one so far that I've discovered. I tried to typeset and get boxes for a bulletin of the AMS paper that was a report on the lectures that Andrew Wiles gave in Cambridge in 1994 on Fermat's last theorem. And it came across, and when I ran it using the script, I came across a problem that I haven't seen for a long time. What happened was that LaTeX 2e went into compatibility mode and said it couldn't find various things and it couldn't do various things. It was a LaTeX 209 file. However, once I have LaTeX 209 installed in my machine, papers from the archive from the 1990s will compile and produce text boxes. And because the format of text boxes hasn't changed with the different versions of LaTeX, the contents may have changed, but the format hasn't. Once I've got the LaTeX 209 installed, I can process all those old documents as well. So this system is likely to give us benefits on legacy documents, documents that are, in some sense, pre-accessibility. I'm now going to show you what we get for outputs. View code. So there's a folder called examples, and the path, and here there's another folder called archive 2101044419. And if you're familiar with the archive, you'll know that that's an archive ID. So let's go into there. There's a source folder, which contains the files I've downloaded from the archive. As you can see, I did it an hour ago. And the TBX contains the box files, one per page. Unfortunately, they're in numerical order according to the first digit. And so you've got page 1, page 2, page 10. Let's look at page 1. So particularly for Dan and Jason, the first a large part of the first 40 lines of the document don't contain any characters at all. It's all fiddling around with glue and stuff to get things in the right place. And there's a PDF dest command, which we don't need to look at now, but it's used for the PDF file, and we can use it too. So line 36 is a PDF dest command, name.start xyz, and who knows what it's used for, but it's used to make the PDF better. And if we build an access tree from this, we can use it to make the access tree better. And then from lines 43 to 50, it's one character per line, one command per line. We've got the word symmetry in a particular font, and then we've got a kern and a space, and then we've got integrability and a kern and a y and geometry. And those people who are sighted can move their eyes up and down to read. So if you move your eyes up and down and you're a sighted person, you can read this stuff. And what we've got here is the running title of the article. So we just go on and on and on. It's a long file because it's one command per line. So every character in the page, every piece of space in the page has its own command. And all the other typesetting bits and pieces. And the syntax of the file makes it quite easy to investigate. And if I scroll down to the end, excuse me, this will take me a while, we see that there are 3,700 lines. Most of which don't contain information that concerns us. But the important thing is that we can read and understand this file in much the same sort of way that LWarp reads and understands a DVI file. So these files are available through
Yeah, so one immediate question would be, once you reconstruct the boxes, you should be able to regenerate a pseudo LaTeX file that you can then process a second time. And then the question is, do you get the same set of boxes?
This is what's called a regression test, isn't it?
Exactly.
Or a round tripping test.
And given that you have a large corpus to play with, this could really be quite useful.
Yeah, well, what we
Is that
need
where
is
you'll find things that didn't translate?
Yeah, just a moment. Sorry, I sit a long way from my desk and I have to get up to change the volume because I can't find the remote. Yeah, I did a little bit of that last week, which wasn't recorded. The easy thing is getting the characters right. Getting the characters is right. It's the spaces between the characters that's difficult. I've heard the same thing said about music, playing the piano. With a few years training, you can learn how to play the notes correctly. But it's the spaces between the notes is where the art lies. So the same is true of typesetting, and for that matter, humor. Timing is very important in humor. So to go back, yes, I'm interested in having a corpus that is representative. I was thinking about that earlier, which is, I think there are about, is it 1/3 articles on the archive? Third of a million? Let's say it's 1/3 of a million. That's 300,000. If we take 1 in 1,000, that's 300 articles. And that would be a representative corpus. If every article in the archive has a serial number or some other similar identifier, we could simply take all the articles whose serial number ends in 1, 2, 3, 4, and that could form a representative archive, a representative sample that different people could study.
Yeah, I think total archive articles is over 2 million.
2 million. Okay, so we'll have to take 1 in 10,000 to get a reasonable size corpus. And even 1 in 100,000 would give us several hundred articles, which we could get to know quite well. So anything that we can do can scale. And any failure for the creation of the boxes or difficulty in creation of the boxes, we can also test for that. So sort of automated testing and exploration ought to be possible. And as Nelson says, there are tests that can be put in afterwards to see that your understanding is correct, and creating a pseudo LaTeX file that should produce the same outputs is a good test that you've got everything working correctly. Do you want to come back on that, Nelson?
Well, it's an obvious first thing to do, because the more documents you try, the more corners of LaTeX they're going to probe, and it may turn out you encounter constructions in the log file that you haven't seen before and aren't handled by the translator. So it's definitely a good exercise. Even just the one-way step of taking several thousand documents and seeing whether your translator recognizes everything in the log file would be a good thing to do.
Yeah, we ought to be able to do the recognition command by command, just as we can sort of read anything written in English, character by character. But it's the way the things are put together that's it's a bit like undoing the activity of a mincer. But a small collection of examples will be enough to give a feel for what's going on. And I would say that even if this works for 20% of legacy articles, that something like LaTeX ML won't work with, that may be sufficient to make it worth developing further and using. So I think some exploratory work would be really helpful for all sorts of reasons. It would be nice if you could predict the success of a translation based upon the analysis of the boxes. That would be nice.
Right. And if you wrap this in a makefile for the conversion of an arbitrarily named document, then make, in the GNU version at least, can parallelize this over an arbitrary number of processes. So you could do hundreds of documents at a time if you have the resources.
Yeah, yeah. There's something else, which is that if you're an author and you're moving over to a new version of LaTeX, you can say, oh, let's check that the new version typesets exactly the same as the old version, or at least tells me. So there's that sort of regression testing that can be done. I think it fits into the archival nature of tech quite well. And the box file actually is archival in a way that the DVI and PDF file isn't. We seem to have, oh yeah. So I wonder if I could very gently encourage Jason or Dan to come in on this.
Well, I'd be happy to comment. So the tech box, the thing that I'm interested in, how does it massage into something that's consumable from my point of view? I understand the regression is definitely important, but I think knowing that we got an output that is even desirable is just as important as well.
I wonder if Jason would like to add to that.
Well, that was one of my questions as well. So it seems to me that you would presumably, you'd want to produce HTML or something similar as an output for this. And then there's the whole question of how do you recognize the various macros and environments that are in the original source document at this stage of processing, because based on this admittedly small sample that I looked at, it doesn't seem as though the details of what the underlying macros were get carried through to this point. So you're going to have to solve that problem.
Yeah, I don't know how bad that problem is going to be. What you definitely do have is every character and the font of every character. And you can most likely deduce from that something about the tagging that should surround the character. Looking at, from what I've looked at, it seems as though the mathematical content can be extracted as mathematical content. And it seems to be quite well structured. So I think identifying all the mathematics in the output would be fairly straightforward. And I think converting that mathematics to an accessible format, again, would be fairly straightforward. I think that would be a sweet spot to start with accessibility. The problem with the characters is they can appear at different places in different regions, and the ordering can get a bit jumbled, such as in 2-column, and you get the line breaks. So how well everything can be glued back together, I don't know. But I take comfort in this, that the LaTeX people are working on producing tagged PDF, and they have to solve exactly the same problems, and they have to go through exactly the same route of the box. But by just stopping at the box, all sorts of manners about knowing when to open and close tags that the LaTeX team are dealing with. And the LaTeX team are also dealing with the problem of inserting the tags without changing the typeset output. Whereas if you just stop at the box and say, well, we're going to throw away the typeset output anyway, so we won't bother putting the tags in. But we will look at the information that we need. So if the LaTeX team can do it, the boxes can do it too. I'd like to ask a different question, which is what will constitute an acceptance test from an accessibility point of view?
Oh, here's one potential test, which would be if you can set up the source document and the macros in such a way that whatever the preferred mechanism is going to be to preserve or to capture the tag information is working, and then you get your output, and then being able to transform that into an HTML file that represents the structure of the document would be a good test. And even if you could just do it with something very simple in the first instance, that would be a significant move in the right direction.
I'm thinking that the A5, R5, which is the unofficial HTML version of the archive, has as its poster article a fairly what's the word? I'm going to use the word elementary. I don't like it. It's not for the research mathematician. It's for the high school sort of mathematician. I think on the quadratic, I can't remember exactly what it's on, but to use that and to see if you can get an output similar to in accessibility terms, to the R5 output would be quite useful, I think. I'll see if I can't put a link to it in the link in the.
I've been thinking about this acceptance criteria you're talking about, and for me, as a screen reader user and such, I'm interested in structures. So if you have something representing your headings, some paragraphs, a couple of lists, some mathematics, and a table, those are your typical content areas that would be pretty easy to access. And the next ones would be figures and such. In the sense that maybe we can peer into what they are, but even just having navigation link above and below where we can skip that information could be quite useful. That would demonstrate you see them.
I'm trying to translate that into what it would mean for me. I think quite rightly, you and Jason are looking at what are the criteria on the outputs. And what I'm interested in is finding existing inputs that should produce the outputs you want. And there's something to be said for producing well-crafted special examples to test various parts of the thing. I just posted into the chat a link to the poster article for the archive, which is a simple proof of the quadratic theorem. And there we go. For some reason, it's, if I could get that to work as well as, now that's an archive article. I've got a feeling, let's see if it's got, yes, I can download the source. So that's an article for which I could download the source and put it through the process. And I could put the source into the Unlatex website so that it's actually part of the project. So from what I'm looking at, I'm looking for enhancement requests or something like that in terms of create an accessible version of this article. And I chose Francis Brown's article because the Andrew Wiles stuff wouldn't work. And I went to a conference where Francis Brown talked about this stuff. But some well-chosen articles from the archive would actually be really helpful in terms of accessibility testing and in terms of having specific goals. Because I think the story of this is that 90% correct is not nearly good enough. You have to be 99.something% correct. And the last decimal points are expensive, but just to get started will be already something.
Could you help me understand what you mean by correct here?
Well, I'm not an expert in accessibility, and I'm certainly not an expert in screen readers and the access tree. In terms of correct articles, I mean articles that have got the right stuff in them in terms of representativity. And in terms of outputs, it's articles that are in practice accessible, not the articles that meet some accessibility criteria, other than the criteria that the people that want to read it can read it. That's the criteria for being accessible. And I'm interested in seeing and producing stuff that is of that nature. Perhaps because of where I'm coming from, both personally in terms of this project, I'm more interested in creating an access tree that happens to be embeddable in HTML rather than HTML that happens to have an access tree. So my main concern is more to generate the correct access tree. And as you said, Dan, various navigation things would be part of the access tree that you'd like. So even though they may not be part of the document structure, if every paragraph had an identifier so you could navigate and tag by paragraph, that might be helpful, even though it's not part of the explicit document structure of the LaTeX. Jason.
So at the moment, at least, an access tree is not something that you can directly manipulate. So that's why you would need to produce some kind of document format, such as HTML, that will then produce the desired an appropriate access tree when that's read in. And obviously, those trees are very much browser and operating system dependent. So there's no single version of that you could try to create directly. The only way to do it practically is to produce some kind of document format which will then be read in by a browser or some other application to generate an access tree appropriately. There's been some work done to enable the properties of that tree to be queried through JavaScript, but as I understand it, they haven't proceeded to the point of letting you build it programmatically yet in any kind of generic way, unless you're writing code for a particular operating system.
Yeah, that access tree.
Go on, Dan.
Yeah, I was going to say that access tree that you've been referring to is more of an artifact of parsing other structures to build a model that then a screen reader could actually use. And you're trying to capture it now and build output from it, which then will go into these pipelines to build a tree again. So it's kind of one of these Mobius things where the snake's turning around and eating its own tail. The thing that, at least for me, that I'm concerned, even if it's not in HTML or whatnot, you come up with a representation, even as like JSON. JSON is a structure that can be fairly accessible if you think about it, if you boil down things into very simple primitives. And that's kind of where this access tree, I think, is going to start, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I'm going to take a few steps back and then go forward a bit. As the sort of proprietor of the project, I've got the things that I particularly want to do and things that I think should be done and all that sort of stuff. But I'd much rather have a project where people could do with it what they thought was right rather than what I thought was right. And so actually one of the criteria for success for me is that people like yourself and Jason can go in and adapt the system to suit their needs. And that's got something to do with the way it's designed, the way it's built, its architecture. It's also got something to do with community involvement and that sort of thing. That's the first sort of stepping back. The second sort of stepping back is that tech in the early 1980s produced what's called the DVI file, and DVI stands for device independent. And the DVI file basically contains very detailed, very precise, very accurate instructions as to where each character should go and what font it should be. And it had some other capabilities as well, but those are the main ones. And it was an printer driver, if you like, for an ideal printer, because its resolution was approximately that of the visible wavelength of light or something ridiculous like that. It was just very high precision. And then particularly Nelson Beebe, from the DVI file, produced a generic way of driving a particular printer. So what that meant was that you had code for understanding DVI that could translate it into the language that a particular printer understood. This was before PostScript printers, basically, and certainly before PDF. And so each printer had its own printer control language. And then to implement a particular printer, you had to implement just the printer control language and not the whole thing. And that was what's called driver files. And perhaps Nelson would like to say something about that in this context.
Yeah, certainly the DVI file is a definitive record of where everything goes on the page, but of course it's missing the markup that says what are those things? Are they chapter headings, section headings, table captions, and so on? However, there's been an important development in the LaTeX 3 project, and that is in the redesign of the whole kernel of LaTeX, they realized it would really be helpful to have hooks into environments so that you could temporarily get control at the start of an environment, just before the end of an environment, and immediately after the end, and maybe on both sides of the begin. I can't remember. But what this would permit you to do, for example, is to create a modified format file for LaTeX that had hooks put in for all of the environments you might be interested in, that would record something in the output stream, notably special commands, which can have more or less arbitrary contents. And you could thereby embed information that this is the start of a table, this is the end of a table, so on, for various kinds of structures in LaTeX. That could be a helpful hint in an HTML conversion, that even if you don't have clear description of say, cells in a table, you at least know where the table starts and where it ends. And if you can capture the caption for the table, you now have a record of what HTML will put at the beginning, namely the table header information. And I think this would not be terribly hard to do. And the LaTeX team has worked quite hard to make sure that documents set in LaTeX 3 that were settable in LaTeX 2e can be settable in LaTeX 3 with essentially identical output. So I'd like to ask the people from the archive who are here, to what extent are you seeing manuscripts coming in that are exploiting LaTeX 3 features, as opposed to the more or less generic LaTeX 2e that we've had for approximately 35 years now?
It's a good question. I haven't really analyzed the newer articles coming in yet. Something to look at.
I can answer that question on behalf of the archive, which is at some point I'll be set up and you could send me a sample of your files and I'll run them through and create the boxes, and I'll give you a census of the PDF commands inside those files, and that will tell you to what extent they're actually being used. In terms of those features, the preambles and stuff don't tell you very much, or they're not I think that easy to use. If you look at the box output, all the stuff that goes in the PDF output, or certainly all the stuff related to the page content, goes through the box. And so if you extract the box as its typeset and put it in the log file, all that information is available to you in this easy form. And then any question you have that relates to that information can be, I hope, fairly easily extracted. So from what Nelson is saying and from what I'm saying, maybe it would be helpful if the archive had some standard samples of documents that people could look at if they're doing research on accessibility. And there may be only 15 or 20 people in the whole world are interested in these standard samples. But if you authorize them as your standard samples, then I could have conversations with other people about a particular document, and they will have processed that same document themselves. We clearly can't process 3 billion documents to have a discussion about PDF specials. But if we could process 1,000 documents to have a discussion about PDF specials, that would be fine.
Yeah, and I'd like to toss in something here. Frank Mittelbach, the project leader of the LaTeX 3 project, has spent the last several years working on a new edition of the LaTeX Companion. That has already gone to the publisher and is in the works. So within the next small number of months, I hope by summer, you will be able to file a lovely 2-volume set of something over 1,500 pages or 2,000 pages of text that will describe in great detail how all of these hooks work and all of the new features of LaTeX 3. And I think that will certainly help to spread the use of such features. And I think it will really help people trying to deal with these translation problems of one document format to another.
I'd like to pick up on something that I can't remember who it was, but it relates to Jason, which is table headings, because I've had a conversation, cooperation with Jason about table data and table heading. And if a table has no heading, then it's often interpreted, I think this is right, Jason, it can be interpreted as markup, layout, rather than semantically a table. There was a discussion on the accessibility list on the TUG website about how to get that information through the LWARP system that Brian Dunn developed. Now that works with special styles on the DVI output, and the DVI output is a representation, an incomplete representation of what's in the box. So in principle, everything in the DVI is already in the box, but the box has more information. The specials disappear as they go into the DVI, and the marks, that's something else, they certainly disappear. So seeing how it works for tables would be quite interesting. And if as a niche case, a special system could be created that would produce accessible tables as well as typeset tables, that would be a useful outcome, because the number of publishers, I'm thinking of the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, because I've sort of seen some articles, they say submit the tables as separate documents in the submission process. So a niche product that would allow you to produce both typeset and accessible tables from a single import in a sensible way would be quite valuable, I think. I don't know if Jason would like to add to that.
So I suppose that in order to get the tagging right, someone is going to have to define macros that allow you to declare which cells are header cells for the table, or if it's an entire row or an entire column, which one it is. And in the absence of that, you would have to make assumptions, or you would need some kind of parameter in the conversion tool to select that and then check the output. So there are ways of working around it if that information is missing, but obviously it really needs to be in the source document in a standard way that authors can include.
Yeah, so there's a lot of practical problems, and not just practical problems, what we might call community issues. It's a question of community adoption.
Yeah, and I can speak to the table and accessibility, within a screen reader setting. The that part you're talking about where it can be confused That usually deals with the old legacy table structures, and there was kind of a smell to the HTML code that would give it away, where tables are being used as typeset vehicles rather than actual tables, for data. And that's usually when it would trip. And you usually saw that when there was a great deal of spanning going on across the table. That it was usually a hint. So if you got, in your source document, tables that have very good cell structures in it, even if you don't have header, it still will be interpreted properly. It's when you start getting into using a table to show 2 columns of text in your document, that's when confusion will start to occur.
I sort of got a strange thought, which is we can agree about some things and we can disagree or differ on some things. I'm glad that we don't all have the same opinions about what sort of food we want to eat, because otherwise all the restaurants would be empty, except the Indian restaurants where there'll be lines going around the block. So diversity of opinion is actually good. Monoculture can be dangerous. But I'm thinking that we can have agreement regarding means and agreement regarding goals. I think agreement regarding goals is more important. And
I would agree.
off you go, Dan.
No, I was just agreeing with you. I think the goals, if we can sort of shoot for the same target, the means add the spice and variety to that restaurant thing you're talking about.
Well, I think there's plenty of room for diversity among implementations and approaches, but on the other side, if you want to provide mechanisms that can be used on the input side to clarify the meaning of certain document structures or certain types of expressions, then I think it's important to have a recognized way of doing it that is part of the language. So I'm less open to multiple ways of doing it on the input side, and because then everybody invents their own, and then implementations have to support it. But there's certainly scope for different implementations on the output side, and we already have that with various document format converters and so forth anyway.
I'll rephrase what you said, Jason, in terms of goals, which is perhaps one of our goals is that you can cut and paste from one document to another. And the other thing is that if you are editing a document that's being authored by a colleague, you don't want to have to learn new software to do that editing. And when I say new software, I mean new markup constructs and everything else like that, new conventions.
Yeah, and if it's just implemented as part of the system that this is how textual alternatives for images are going to be represented, or this is how table header cells will be identified, and various other constructs of that nature, then I think that would certainly simplify everything for authors who are willing to add a few extra macros to achieve better accessibility, but who need a well-defined way of doing it.
If I could chime in here, I definitely agree with that sort of thinking, the limiting the way the input is happening. To me, a lot of these accessibility features have no typeset equivalent. They're purely structural. And that typesetting is just giving in text vernacular, a visual way of representing it on a physical piece of page. But in an informational sense, it's only logical. There's nothing physical about it. We're just putting groupings in there. And so I could see LaTeX being developed that actually has no typeset mark on the page itself. Hopefully that makes sense.
I wonder whether it might be useful to implement some kind of typeset the markup explicitly mode that gives a visual representation of every markup level structure in a document, not as something that would normally be used, but it could be used as a kind of a proofreading tool. And I'm wondering whether that might be useful.
Somebody I worked with at Cambridge University Press, who in some respects a pioneer of multiple output publishing in special cases, said that if the authors don't see the alternative outputs, their quality will end up being poor.
Correct.
And the best way to get high quality alternative outputs is that the alternative outputs are actually useful to the author. So if the alternative outputs give the author something that is helpful to them, then the quality will improve.
I'm going to ask a silly question here.
No, you're not. Sorry, I'm contradicting you into the host.
So I have professed that I am not a tech or LaTeX guy. I know of it, and I definitely don't speak its language or its conventions or anything. But when these papers get to a certain size, do they have a table of contents? Do they have a table of figures and those sorts of things? And how are those things generated?
They do have a table of contents, and actually the way they're generating is quite interesting. Information is written to an auxiliary file from time to time, and what happens, you see, the thing about the table of contents is you have to put the page numbers onto the table of contents, and even if you're not the page numbers, you've got to put sort of section numbers or stuff. And those are generated through the typesetting process. So that auxiliary information actually goes in to the box file. So it's potentially there. So yes, they do have tables of contents, and some of them, I think, have, some of them have internal hyperlinks. So an alternative version of this is theorem numbers. So you have theorem numbers, and you can click on the theorem number, be taken to the theorem. And all that is done by putting stuff in the PDF at the end of the day. And the stuff that's being put in is accessible through the box. So instead of it being manifest through the clickable links on the PDF, it's already manifested in the box, and so should be manifested in any alternative formats generated from the box. I don't know if that's answered your question sufficiently, Shamsi.
Well, so the reason I asked is because to me, the structures that we're talking about for accessibility is kind of revolving around those kind of processes, because we're trying to generate structure that the author would find useful. I don't know if they have a way to bring up, like in a screen reader, I can bring up a dialogue that says, show me all the headings, show me all the links, show me all the lists.
I think what might be useful is the ability to extract all the equations, for example, and typeset them without the words.
Mm-hmm. There's another example of that. Structure is quite valuable, even though it doesn't necessarily have a typesetting correspondence.
Sorry, I missed that, Dan.
Which part did you miss?
No, it's from the beginning, I'm afraid.
Well, I was talking about, your math example, pulling out the equations. That is yet another example where structure being added more explicitly in the source, and hopefully better than a conventional way where everybody sort of agrees, can really improve the author's life without necessarily having a typeset correspondence in a physical page.
I put in a link to the JATS. I don't know. It's like a document, concepts for documents. It's a format that represents a journal article, and it includes all of the semantic elements that a journal article is made of. And it seems the more that I think about accessibility, the more that I think that we should just agree on some standard like this that represents the elements. And I think JATS might be better than HTML because it's more targeted at journal articles. But there's a link in chat to think about all the elements that it represents or can represent. It's better, I think, than LaTeX, at least at semantic tagging.
I believe, or from what I understand from the LaTeX core working group from Frank's group, is that the changes that they're working on now, which will take a few years, but when they've completed that work, that they will be able to export to formats like JATS. I could have that wrong, but that's my current understanding. So it would be nice, of course, if it's not an either or, if an author must use LaTeX or just really wants to use LaTeX, that they could, but that we could have, like Christopher said, that we could eventually be targeting this shared language. And JATS does seem to be a shared language among many publishers, but it's not what people author in. It'd be nice to close the gap between what people author in and what the eventual publishing language is.
It's developed as a standard, like it's a national standard, and it's also there is a version of it intended for authors to author in. Like so somebody thought about it really hard and thinking about what would you need if you were going to make a document using this format? What are all the tags you'd need? But that doesn't mean anyone's ever really tried it or that anybody ever used it that way. So it'd be interesting to. It's too bad that I haven't heard much about it from an authoring perspective, but it would be interesting to know, is this feasible to write in? Our Markdown, and for instance, is becoming very popular. That one actually gets use as an authoring format, and its follow-up language, Quattro, introduces more elements for authoring documents. They may win out over JATS in the end, but JATS seems like it's well considered, and because it was developed by the organizations that are in publishing, it's able to capture all of the things that go into published work, in commercial published work.
I think there's something I'm very grateful to you for that, Christopher, and I've had to look at the website, and what interests me is the latter part of the URL. It's the National Library of Medicine of I think it's National Institute of Health of .gov, which is the United States government. Now that's a whole completely different community than the mathematicians and the theoretical physicists.
I did not hear about JATS until I started attending Tech Hour, and one of your guests comes from publishing and talks about it on occasion.
Oh yeah, Carvey hasn't been for a bit. Yeah, but the biochemistry, biotechnology, medicine are really important subjects. They have their own communities of practice. They have their own needs for accessibility. And it would be nice if we could share work and share concepts and share standards and share ideas. and a bit of getting to know each other would be, I think, a really good thing.
I have a brief comment on that. One of the first things which sort of scared me when I started using LaTeX to write papers was that the standard article class or style as it was back then has title, author, date. And a typical journal will have a list of authors with current institute, with former institute, with email addresses, with corresponding author. In the old days, send off-prints requests to so-and-so. And each author had a footnote symbol, a letter, a number, and the macros had things like, you know, footnote symbol, dagger, whatever. And it said it properly, but there's absolutely no context. It was a purely visual formatting. And this is something which essentially every technical journal has, not just in physics, but which it seems that the various journal article classes and so on, everyone has sort of rolled their own and they're completely incompatible. And something like this, I just had a brief look at it. That would certainly looks applicable if it can handle that. But you need author, email, current address, adjunct address, former address, email, is he the corresponding author, blah, blah, and in a structured format. And otherwise it's just gobbledygook, and you really have to know the journal itself to parse the output and find out what sort of structure is intended.
I've got an amazing statistic. I should first of all say that 4 out of 5 statistics that you hear on the internet have been made up. Which is, I reckon, that if you look at research mathematical articles, the ratio of readers that are cited to the readers that are blind is probably 10 or 50 to 1 in favor of the blind readers. In other words, every article that's read by one sighted person is read by about 50 blind readers. And when I say a blind reader, I mean a computer, as well as a person who's actually blind. So everything that's read by a search engine so that it can be discovered is being read by a blind reader. And that fits in with the structured information that JATS and the like providing. JATS is providing information that is accessible to blind computers. And it may be that we can leverage that interest that computers have in reading our stuff to help people who are not sighted to read our stuff. I'll stop.
It's certainly a good idea. If you look at Google Scholar citations, when they find a new citation, sometimes it's just random characters, and you have to look at the original and figure out, okay, that's why I parsed it this way, but I know it's wrong. But without a human to interpret it, it doesn't really make any sense. Reminds me of something an astronomer once told me, that these days, almost all images taken of the sky by large telescopes will never be seen by a human. They're all, computer processed, and we get a best of at the end. So it's a similar sort of idea. It has to be done with the blind reader in mind, really.
I'm thinking that people can stay if they want to. We've had a really nice discussion, and I think that's actually what I wanted secretly from this, was a discussion that provided a context for what I'm doing, and providing that context gives me some landmarks and orientation and a little bit of encouragement. As I'm now only the co-host, people can stay afterwards, of course. They're very welcome to. Perhaps I can ask Shamsi to see if there are any closing remarks and to formally close the meeting and turn the recording off. Nelson's got something.
I'd like to ask one question just before we close, and that is, last week I mentioned that the the Association for Computing Machinery, the computer scientist professional organization, has recently announced they will require ORCID identifiers for authors of papers. And I put in a link in the chat to the orcid.org site. I just wanted to ask whether ORCIDs have been discussed at archive.org as unique identifiers for authors, so you can distinguish D. Knuth from D.E. Knuth from Donald E. Knuth, Don Knuth, and several other variants.
Yeah, you can associate your ORCID ID with your account. The problem is going backwards. I mean, there's just so much material in the system right now that
right. So what ACM did was to say, going forward from presumably a date sometime early this year, ORCIDs will be mandatory.
Yeah, some journals require them. Yeah.
Philip, are you seeing that in the physics literature?
Oh yeah, if you look at ADS, which is the huge database of astronomy articles run by NASA at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, they've had this for a while, that you can associate the ORCID with a name and so on. And it's quite useful. I mean, it's more useful for John Smith than it is for, Nelson Beebe, for example. But it's certainly something that really has its, I think is a really good idea. And people change their name when they get married or whatever. And it's, a unique identifier for authors is, I'm surprised that it hasn't been around longer, actually.
Yeah. The one constraint on it is that it has to be applied for by living authors. You cannot get an ORCID for a deceased author. So we don't have a unique identifier for Albert Einstein, but most people know him as Einstein. And so that hasn't been much of a source of confusion, but still it would be helpful. And one does see from time to time papers published with a little dagger attached to a name saying that this author died during the publication process. But it would certainly be something that we ought to be considering in any new design of front matter for documents, that you really want to have something like a unique identifier. We're having a discussion right now in my department of what to do about people who leave the department and move to a new institution. And I'm arguing that once we publish their website, we really have an obligation to keep it in existence in perpetuity, because people link to it. We mustn't break their links.